Shalom. Welcome. I'm Rabbi Scott with Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue, and we are doing our Torah study from home. And so welcome to our home. This is a ministry of Beth Yeshua Messianic Synagogue in Fort Myers. And you can find our videos here on YouTube, of course, and you can find our Revelation study videos here, Torah study, and our Shabbat services likewise. If you are in Fort Myers, then I welcome you to come join us and to visit us in our services and to fellowship and to worship with us. We are meeting during this time, but of course we are observing social distancing, and we have still some seats available in our congregation synagogue, in our sanctuary, available to join us with room for social distancing requirements, of course. Okay, a special invite to our High Holy Day services. In the description below, I will place a link to our schedule for our High Holy Day services. If you would like to join us online, all these services will be streamed and available online. And if you would like to join us in person, and you'd like to have any questions you have answered, please give us a call. But if you would like to join us and visit with us, we would welcome you. We would enjoy meeting you and fellowshipping with you during this time. So a link to the schedule for High Holy Days will be in the comments below. Beginning with, of course, Rosh Hoshanah, which is this Shabbat. How is this week unlike any other week? Because this week is Rosh Hoshanah, and it is on Shabbat, also known as Yom Teruah. Rosh Hoshanah, the head of the year, the beginning of the new year on the Jewish calendar, or Yom Teruah is the day that it's known in the Bible. Yom Teruah means the day of the blast, the day of the shofar blast. In one place it's called Yom Teruah, in another place it's called Yom Zichron Teruah, meaning the day of the remembering of the blast, or the memorial of the blast, referring to the shofar blast. We have 2 days to celebrate Rosh Hashanah. The question comes up, why do we have 2 days to celebrate Rosh Hashanah? Because what happened was, going back many years, they needed to start the day. Rosh Hashanah, of course, begins on the Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, and the new moon is sighted by the first glimpse by reliable witnesses of the actual sliver of the new moon, and that would establish the day. Now we have calendars and the ability to calculate the day of the new moon, but we're still bound by the observance. And what would happen is that while they would set aside a certain day and say this will be the new moon, until the new moon was actually sighted, that day wasn't the new moon, it wasn't the Rosh Chodesh, nor was it the Rosh Hashanah, the Yom Teruah, because they hadn't sighted the moon. And what would happen is various people would work, and because they hadn't declared it, they hadn't ratified it or confirmed it yet, people would fill up their days with important tasks and this kind of thing. And then by the time the announcement came out that it was going to be that day, or that it was going to be the next day, in some cases some people had gone ahead and worked on what was then almost post facto declared a Shabbat and declared a day of memorial, a day of observance. So rather than deal with this ambiguity, the sages decided to set up 2 days, and that's what we have with us today. We have 2 parshiot to read from because of these 2 days. These 2 parshiot is, the first is Genesis 21, the second parsha is Genesis 22. Both days, the maftir portion, the last reading of the 7 readings from the Torah, the maftir portion that introduces the Haftorah blessings and introduces the Haftorah portion. We haven't emphasized the Haftorah in our studies this year because we really wanted to just focus on the Torah. So we haven't really talked about the Haftorah very much. Perhaps next year, in next year's cycle, we'll get into some of that. But this year, we just wanted to keep it with the Torah. So we haven't really talked about the Haftorah very much. The Haftorah is the weekly reading portion from the prophets of the Bible. Uh, the maftir is the last portion before the Haftorah portion. The maftir on these days, Rosh Hashanah 1 and 2, the maftir is Numbers 29, which is, of course, the instructions for observing Yom Teruah and Bamidbar in Numbers. There it's referred to as Yom Teruah, which is the day of the blowing trumpets. The Haftorah portions for the first day, Rosh Hashanah 1, is 1 Samuel chapter 1, and the Haftorah portion for the second day is Jeremiah 31. So let's begin this week with some summaries, if we can. In Genesis 21, Adonai remembered Sarah and did for Sarah what was promised, it says. There came abuse from Ishmael, the son of Hagar, which was targeted against Isaac, the son of Sarah, that Sarah delivered as a result of this promise from Adonai. And so Abraham has to send Hagar and Ishmael away in order to keep peace and at the direction of Adonai. Following this narrative is the narrative of the dispute over the wells with Abimelech. Abraham and Abimelech come to a covenant. It is the covenant of the 7 lambs, and it is to commemorate the reminder of the wells, of these wells. The second, the Haftorah portion for the first day of Rosh Hashanah, for the Genesis chapter 21, is 1 Samuel 1. Hannah is the wife without children, the wife of Elkanah. The other wife has many children, but Hannah does not have many children. She does not have any children. This ought to be a familiar refrain for us, for we see Hagar and Sarah dealing with Ishmael, and then we see Rachel and Leah dealing with all the children of Leah. Let's see if we're coming back up. She makes a vow before Adonai, and in this vow she says to Adonai, take notice of my humiliation. Give your servant a male child. She prayed for a long time before Adonai. At this time in history, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, was at Shiloh, and so you would go to Shiloh to make sacrifices, and they had gone to visit Shiloh to make their sacrifices, and she made this vow to promise the child to Adonai in her prayers. Samuel was born. Samuel would bring in the end of the time of the judges, that he was dedicated as a prophet to Adonai, and he was acknowledged as a prophet by the entire nation of Israel. Samuel would bring in the end of the time of the judges, and he would anoint first Saul as king and then David as king. The second day of Rosh Hashanah the portion is Genesis 22. This is the Akedah, where Adonai asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, his only son, whom he loved. It's verbalized. It's expressed in the form of a request. Adonai says, "Please," to take him to the place that Adonai is going to show him, which is out on Mount Moriah, and sacrifice him there. And so Abraham does this thing and takes his son Isaac to Mount Moriah, and Isaac was willingly bound and was laid upon the wood. Adonai stayed Abraham's hand just before he was about to take Isaac's life, and we have this narrative where the life of Isaac was spared. The maftir for the second day is again the same portion, Numbers 29. The maftir for both days is Numbers 29. The Haftorah portion for the second day for Genesis 22 is Jeremiah 31, speaking of rebuilding Israel, of loving with an everlasting love. Sing for joy for Jacob, that Adonai has saved his people, has saved the remnant of Israel, that they will come weeping and praying as they return. They will come back. I will bring them back, says Adonai. I will lead them by smooth paths so they don't stumble, for I am a father to Israel, says Adonai. Adonai first scattered Israel, but he is bringing them back. He has ransomed Jacob, it says. And then we have this line, a voice is heard in Ramah. It is Rachel weeping for her children, and she refuses to be comforted because they are no more. Adonai says to stop your weeping and to dry your eyes. Your work will be rewarded. What is this work of Rachel? It is the weeping of intercession. It is the work of intercession that she had that was going to be rewarded, and was rewarded with the return of Israel. The return of Israel brings about the new covenant. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, it says. I think that's an important distinction in the text, that this is a covenant with the house of Israel, and it's going to come after those days. What is the after those days? It is when Israel returns. Adonai finishes this by saying he has ordained the laws of the heavens, that if these laws leave my presence, then the offspring of Israel will stop being a nation in my presence forever. If the sky above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth can be fathomed, then I will reject the offspring of Israel for all that they have done. Speaking specifically of idolatry, but also of not keeping the mitzvot. But Adonai says he will not do this, that he will not reject them for what they have done, that even though they have committed transgressions against Adonai, that he will not reject them, because he has ordained them as his own in the same way that he has ordained the laws of the heavens. Okay, so that's the blast, as it were, no pun intended, of course, of the Torah portion and the half Torah portions these 2 days for Rosh Hoshanah. So how does all this hang together for Rosh Hoshanah, this Yom Teruah? How does this all kind of connect? We like to draw connections and conclusions here when we study the Torah, and we find it's a very fun way to find the relevancy and connect with it. So is there a unified theory? Is there a unified sort of thread running through all this, through these parshiot? We have this instruction, the Yom Zichron Teruah, the day of the memorial of the shofarot, the blast. And then it says in another place, Yom Teruah, the day of the blowing of trumpets, the blowing of the shofarot. When it comes to the memorial of the shofar, what is it we remember? What practically do we remember? What do we call to mind when we think of the shofar? Well, the first one that we think of perhaps is Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. That is, that when at Mount Sinai the sound of the shofar became louder and louder, and Adonai came down to actually reveal himself to his people, to speak with his people, that they all heard his voice. So we have this, but where are some other places that we remember the shofar from? Where's another place that we might remember the shofar? Well, one that's probably in most people's minds is Joshua at Jericho. Joshua, of course, leads the people to surround the city of Jericho for 7 days, and on the seventh day they march around it 7 times, and at the end of which they blow their shofar, they blow their trumpets, and they shout, and the walls came crashing down, and Jericho was defeated. Most of us are familiar with that story. But how about another place? Any other place that we remember shofar from the narrative in the Bible? How about Gideon when he went up against the Midianites? So we've got these 3 examples: Moses at Mount Sinai, Joshua at Jericho, and Gideon at Midian. The first one, Moses at Mount Sinai, was all about revelation. The revelation through Moses to the people of the very character, the nature, and the attributes, the very person of Adonai. At Jericho, Joshua led us with great courage to come against the walls of Jericho with nothing but shofar and shouts from the people. And at Midian, with Gideon, we remember Gideon for the fleece tests. He put out the fleece 2 days in a row. And for the thinning of the army. Remember, he recruited a great army. He recruited 32,000 men from the different tribes to go up and defeat the Midianites. And Adonai said, that's too many. And so they said, if anybody's afraid, he can go home. And so 22,000 went home. And then he was left with 10,000. And Adonai said that's still too many. So he took them to the brook to water. And those that went down on their knees into the water to drink versus those that lapped up water in their hand, there were 300 that were selected because they picked up the water in their hand to drink. So he went from 32,000 men down to 300. Gideon divided those 300 men into 3 columns and gave each man a pot, a torch, and a shofar. They came upon the Midianites, and they surrounded the Midianites. They threw down their pots, lit their torches, and blew their shofarot as they surrounded the camp of the Midianites at night. The Midianites were in such a panic they fought with each other at first, and there was a great slaughter. And these 300 of Gideon's troops defeated an army of over 120,000. You can find all this narrative in Judges 6 and 7. So these are the 3 narratives of the shofar. This is what we remember, at least. What else do we see coming together in the Torah readings today? Another thread that we see in these readings and in the immediate previous chapters, in other words, just surrounding these actual parsha, what we see in a consistent thread through all these passages is drama with mothers and sons. We've got something happening with mothers and sons in all these passages. First of all, we've got Hagar with Ishmael. Sarah was barren, and she didn't have children. Hagar had a child by Abraham, that was Ishmael. And we have a problem, and now this is creating conflict in the home. Sarah ultimately does have a child, that is Isaac, and there's conflict and abuse between Ishmael and Isaac, and Hagar and Ishmael need to be sent away. Sarah starts out barren, but she does ultimately have a child. Ishmael is the farthest of the other sons from Adonai. He is the one that is most removed from a relationship with Adonai, according to the text. But we have this that Abraham has to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Next we have Hannah with Samuel, mother and son, sort of narrative there. And then we have in the Jeremiah Haftorah portion, Jeremiah 31, we have Rachel with her children. And of course we know the story of Rachel. Rachel was likewise barren for a length of time, desperately wanted children, and Leah had many children. Very similar experience to what Hannah had with the other wife. 2 wives, one of them's having children, the other is not. So you see these common threads that we're seeing putting together here. Another aspect of these sort of conflicts between mothers and sons, and tension between mothers and sons, and just emotional drama between mothers and sons, we see that Abraham is called to bring Isaac up on the mountain to sacrifice him. And of course Abraham obeys, and Abraham passes the test. At the end of this narrative, we see that Abraham goes back to his tent, and then we see that Isaac goes down into the desert, and we see that Sarah, the next line that we have is the passing of Sarah, and Abraham has to travel to see her. And we get a sense here, you get a sense here that perhaps there was some conflict between Abraham and Sarah based on what Abraham did with Isaac. And the next time we see these two, Sarah has perhaps had to deal with this near-death experience with her son. If you've ever had a miscarriage, or a health scare with a child, and have come close to losing the child, or in a miscarriage have lost a child, it rattles you, it shakes you up, it disturbs your foundation, It injures your psyche. And this is what I think may have happened with Sarah when she realized what had happened with Isaac up on the mountain, that Abraham came so close to killing her son. Remember, in that culture, a woman's status is in her sons. In her sons is where she has her wealth and security. So a woman without a son is basically a non-person, and a woman with a son will be taken care of into her age. That's the way that it worked. Likewise, Hannah, with Samuel, Hannah gave up her son in the way that Sarah, that Sarah almost gave up her son. Likewise, Hannah had to, for the most part, give up her son. It's interesting that Hannah would make a coat for Samuel every year when she came to see him at Shiloh. The other aspect that we have in this is the reference to Rachel with her children. Once again, losing her children. It is Rachel likewise losing her children, kind of in a similar fashion to Hannah losing her child, similar to Sarah losing her child. But here, Rachel losing her children, we think of this in terms of Joseph being sold into slavery. She lost Joseph. She didn't really lose Benjamin. She lost her own life at the birth of Benjamin. So I'm not sure that quite is the same expression. What we come to understand is that Rachel's weeping for her children is weeping for the people of Israel, the children of Jacob. That is, the ultimate is the restoration of Israel, and that is what is the weeping of Rachel is going to accomplish. Okay, final connection with these mothers and sons, of course, is Miriam and Yeshua, mother and son. Yeshua is the ultimate and necessary restoration of all Israel, and so that's how we make that connection. So we have these women who, in my notes I said they're desperate women. I don't know that that's very fair. It's not that they're desperate women. It's just that the stakes are very high with each of them. In the way that Eve is characterized and described by her husband Adam as the mother of all the living. These women, Sarah, Hannah, Rachel, these women bring forth life out of the peoples of the earth. What did Adonai promise Abraham? He promised him land and descendants and land. And we see this over and over to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who became Israel. So, all these women are not just responsible to bring forth a child, but the children that they bring forth are just very important children to the people of Israel. What else do we see tying all these portions together? Notice that in Genesis 17, Abraham is circumcised. And in chapter 18, Abraham is sitting in the shade of the tree. He's at the base of a tree, and Adonai comes and visits him. And Abraham rushes to prepare a meal for him. This is the narrative, and this is Genesis 18. And they all end up under a tree. They end up under a tree, having a meal under a tree. And this is where Adonai promises a child to Sarah. Bear in mind that Sarah is barren and has been barren all these years. There's indication in the text that Sarah was actually barren before she was married to Abraham, which begs the question, how was it known that she was barren? And if it was, it must have been some sort of birth defect or some sort of condition that she had. And if that's the case, then it speaks even more of Abraham's kindness to Sarah when he took her as a wife. It was a double blessing. It was like being adopted and married. He took her as a wife, but also took her as a sister when she had lost her father. It's a sense of adoption, if you will. Isn't this what Adonai has offered us? That he has adopted us as sons and daughters, and he has made us a bride to his bridegroom, to his son. in a sense, and Yeshua said this, you are all brothers, in a sense that Adonai has made us a bride to the bridegroom, but also a sibling, an adopted sibling to the Son. But for all their lives, Zerah was barren. This is an example of what is called a yibum, a levirate marriage in the text, long before the law had been established or determined, revealed at Horeb. A levirate marriage is when a person is a woman dies, or I'm sorry, a man dies before having a child by his wife, and his brother comes and has a child by that widow in order to bring forth a son, for two reasons. One, to make sure the woman is cared for and she has status in the community, and the other as a form of like a social security, a safety net, if you will. And the other reason for this is that the name of the deceased does not die out in Israel. And this is what the text says. So that's a yibum marriage. And as such, that levirate marriage is for the purpose of bringing forth a child from what would otherwise been a disaster. So why is it so profound that Adonai promises a child? Why is it so profound that he does this under a tree? Where do we see this again? What is happening with these trees? We were speaking of Gideon a little bit ago, and we go back to Gideon, and we see in Judges chapter 6 that Adonai visited Gideon, declaring him a valiant hero. Adonai is with you, declares the angel of Adonai, and offers this first sign. Gideon is asking for this first sign. He says, allow me to make you a meal. Don't leave until I have prepared it for you. And so Gideon goes and puts broth in a pot, and he puts meat in a basket and brings it back to the angel of the Lord there under the tree. And the angel of the Lord had him put it on a rock and touched the rock with the staff, and the entire offering was burned up. It was entirely consumed. But notice the meal in the pot. The pot has a meal in it. The pot has a broth in it. Later, under the 300 men, Gideon had them take empty pots. They took empty pots into battle, which is an interesting spiritual lesson for us if we choose to allegorize it like this, that God uses empty pots in battle. And if we want to be useful to him, we need to become emptied of ourselves, and so he can fill us with his light. What did they put in the pots? They put torches in the pots. What does Yeshua say about your light? You don't put your light under a basket. You don't hide it in a pot. There's the similarity right there. So yeah, if you want to call attention to that lesson, that's kind of a no-brainer right there. So we've got all these sort of kind of tenuous connections and references here in the text, and I would like to perhaps try to tie some of this stuff together. And all this we're discussing is in the context of remembering the shofar. What is it about the shofar? Two aspects to the shofar. The first is it is the sound at the mountain, the call of attention from Adonai to get your attention as he reveals himself to you. The essence of the Sinai experience was Adonai presenting himself, coming down in cloud and fire, in smoke, and in thunder, and in the sound of the shofar getting louder and louder. This was the experience of Adonai revealing himself to the people of Israel. I mean, consider this moment, the weight of this moment. This had never happened previously in human history and has not happened since. That Adonai came down in the fullness of his majesty like this and presented himself, revealed himself to the people. when I was courting my wife, I tried to be very careful. I tried to present myself in the best way manner. I tried to present myself, but it wasn't until after we were married that I really got to know her. Adonai is trying to present himself to the people of Israel that they would know who he is before and while they're entering into this covenant. The second aspect of the shofar is the announcement of two things. It's the announcement of judgment against the enemies of Adonai, and it's the announcement of a time of return, of teshuvah, of repentance. It's an announcement of the coming reality, the unavoidable reminder of our sinfulness before Adonai. The shofar is our way of artificially creating this atmosphere of being confronted by the presence of Adonai. And consider the appearance of an angel, and I've talked about this many times. What is it the angel says every time that the angels appear to a man on the earth? The first thing they say is, don't be afraid. We're afraid because we're in the presence of holiness. That is a kind of terror for us. We are afraid because we think we might surely perish in that type of situation. The fear is a byproduct of our encounter with Adonai in this present form, in this present realm, if you will. But what I want to emphasize is not just the fear of that moment, but what is the purpose of that encounter in the first place? Why does Adonai present himself to us? Whether it's in the form of a messenger as an angel, or in the form of the revelation at Mount Horeb. What is this? Why is there any encounter with Adonai? Well, the purpose of the encounter for those who are his, who belong to him, is to come into this in a place of restoration. What was the first thing that Yochanan said when he saw Yeshua? Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. He could have said, behold the Son of God here on this earth. He could have said, behold the King of Israel, the King of Judah. Let's all bow down. Why was the first thing that Yochanan saw was the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world? Why did that come first? Because that is the starting place in our relationship with Adonai. The gospel in recent years has become diluted and watered down with its emphases on grace and forgiveness, but the reality of forgiveness is that it is offered in exchange and trade for our sin, provided we're able to enter into that exchange. It looks like this. Imagine if I was a child of the streets, if I was an orphan, and I am adopted. I'm made into a child of a wealthy, powerful family. The first thing they're going to do is give me a set of clothes. I need to get out of my street rags and get dressed. They're going to give me a change of clothes. But if all I do is change my clothes, I may look like I fit in, but under the clean clothes, I'm really kind of the same person. What really needs to happen is I probably need a bath. And then I may need some medical attention. I may need some grooming. There may be some hygiene things that need to happen. It's not enough just to put on the clothes of somebody who's wealthy if I'm still unchanged underneath. In our relationship with Adonai, we accept the garments of salvation. We are justified by the sacrifice of Yeshua. And this is true, and this is absolute. We are saved in Yeshua. We have our redemption and our atonement and our salvation is in Yeshua. There's no question. But what I'm submitting to you is that we still need to be cleansed. It says if we confess our sins, he is faithful to forgive us and cleanse us from all unrighteousness. To admit and to acknowledge our sin is what's on the table here. If a husband never said the words, I know I was wrong, I'm sorry, please forgive me. If a husband never says those words, his marriage would suffer. Now, he may have married a gracious woman who won't divorce him. They may still be married. His wife may forgive him. She may accept him. She may even still do his socks and make his lunch. but his marriage suffers. This is absolute. His marriage will suffer. Psalm 32 speaks of this. When I kept silent, my bones became brittle through my groaning all day long, for day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was drained as in the droughts of summer. Selah. Then I acknowledged my sin to you. I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I confess my transgressions to Adonai, and you forgave the guilt of my sin. Selah. Yes, our salvation in the forgiveness of our transgressions is entirely in the sacrifice of Yeshua. However, we still have to acknowledge our sins and get cleansed and get clean. What did Yeshua say to Peter? He said, if I do not wash you, you have no part with me. So, we have all these kind of loose and tangential connections in the Torah portion and the Tanakh readings for this week. Here's what I want to see. Here's kind of what I'm drawing out of this. We are brought by virtue of the shofar back to the place where we acknowledge our sin. Remember, David had committed adultery, deception, and murder, and apparently he was not very moved by the fact. He wasn't trying to make amends or make things right. It wasn't until the prophet brought a parable about the poor man who had his lamb taken away from him. Not until then did David acknowledge his sin, because we as human beings, even in the kingdom, are blind to our own need for confession, acknowledgement, and cleansing. The shofar is our parable. Yeshua had the parable of, the Nathan came and told the parable that convicted David. The shofar is what convicts us. This is what I see, is that we have this, it's almost like two sides of the same coin. The shofar blast for those who have a heart towards Adonai is the beginning of a journey of cleansing. The shofar blast for those who do not know Adonai, for them it is judgment. Let's speak of the mothers and sons. We spoke of this a little bit earlier, of mothers and sons, this thread that's running through this Torah portion. Hagar brought forth Ishmael. To be a man, she gave him a bride from Egypt. She held his hand tightly to make him a man. Sarah brought forth Isaac, to be the son of the promise, to be the willing sacrifice. Hannah brought forth Samuel, to be the prophet that anointed David, to assure the line of Yeshua, the line of the tribe of Judah. Rachel brought forth the children of Jacob, by the work of her prayers, by her weeping. Miriam brought forth Yeshua, a light unto all the peoples. Of men in Adonai, Abraham brought his son to the mountain of sacrifice to set the terms for the ultimate sacrifice of the son of Elohim. Moses brought forth the revelation, the word of Torah that is to be the basis for all mankind's interactions with Adonai, to reveal the character and the attributes of Adonai. With the sound of the shofar, Moses received the revelation. Joshua brought forth victory as they entered the land. Gideon brought forth despair in the enemy as they turned on each other, and they were overwhelmed by the people of Adonai. Now, what is our place with all this? What do we gather from all this? Like the mothers of Israel, we are not barren, but we are to bring forth new life. We are to bring forth new life in the kingdom. Like Abraham, Moses, Joshua, and Gideon, we are to bring forth first, giving all on the altar of sacrifice. Then, when we have become the victorious champions that Adonai will use in these days to bring victory and judgment, then, having become what he has created for us to be, then we will see victory over the darkness, and we will see judgment over the enemies of Adonai. And this is what I see as the two sides of the shofar. The shofar is there to rattle the faithful and is there to defeat the faithless. Again, victory over the darkness and judgment over the enemies of Adonai. Shalom, shalom.